Hello, thank you for taking the time to watch this pre-recorded version of our final presentation regarding the Fishing Creek Watershed Flooding Assessment and Mitigation Study that we have completed on behalf of Columbia County. My name is Erin Threet with HRG Engineering, and I will be walking through the presentation this evening. Brief overview of the agenda for the presentation. First, I'm just going to briefly introduce the project team. Then I'm going to go through the watershed study area outline and goals of what we're trying to accomplish here. Briefly go through some of the draft findings throughout the report, including problem area identification, discussion of our study areas and subwatersheds, and then some examples of proposed mitigation measures. After that, we're going to talk through next steps and implementation of this plan. And then we will, in the live version, have a break to open house to allow for comments and questions. Okay, so as promised, a brief introduction of the project team. I've already said that my name is Erin Threet. I am Assistant Vice President at HRG, managing our Lewisburg office. The whole team will be there as part of the presentation. Matt Banaski, the project manager, Scott Smith, project engineer, Isaac Underhill, another project engineer, Caitlin Mills, project planner, and Dave Pyle, a project engineer. We'd also like to acknowledge the roles of Columbia County and specifically Eric Staley, the resiliency officer there, and then Terry Provost and Jerry Ziegler from CEDACOG. They've been instrumental in getting this work done. And finally, just a brief acknowledgement that we've enjoyed our coordination with the West End Flood Study Project team led by Gordon Lawson. Okay, so starting with the technical aspects of the presentation. This slide provides an outline of our study area. So we were tasked by the county with looking at the Fishing Creek watershed within the boundaries of Columbia County. So that watershed encompasses 18 municipalities. It's just under 230 square miles. And just as a point of reference, that area is over 1.5 times the area of Philly, almost 4 times the area of Pittsburgh, and 52 times larger than the area of Bloomsburg. So it was a lot of land to be looking at. Within the watershed, there's just under 300 miles of waterway. An additional fun fact is that 5% of Pennsylvania's covered bridges are within the Fishing Creek watershed in Columbia County. That is both a fun fact as well as just a point of reference because some of these bridges do cause some issues with flooding. As far as land use and form throughout the watershed, it's primarily forested and used for agriculture, but there are also a lot of fill impacts within the floodway and the floodplain watershed wide, structures and things built up right to creeks. It's pretty consistently happening throughout the watershed. We also wanted to just provide a brief snapshot of what's been happening with flooding that's occurred in the past, which is obviously a big reason why this study was undertaken. So for the last 40 years that we had available data, 1978 to 2018, there were about $37 million of losses paid due to flooding, which does not include damages to infrastructure. That's purely property loss. And if you take that same level of damage projected over the next 40 years, that would equate to $150 million plus. So there's definitely some issues with flooding in the watershed, which is why, again, the commissioners have asked us to help them complete this study. As far as the goals of the study go, pretty simple. We were tasked with identifying flooding problem areas within the watershed, and then subsequently identifying and assessing proposed mitigation measures or projects to address those flooding problem areas. So how do we do that? Going to talk a little bit later on about how we identified the problem areas, and spoiler alert, there are more than 50 of them that were identified. So we had to come up with a system of, once we identified problems and associated proposed mitigation measures, we had to figure out a way to organize them to make this an implementable plan. So we came up with a priority ranking system that takes into account 5 major aspects of each problem area and its associated solution. So there were points assigned to each of these categories, they were weighted accordingly, and then at the end of the day, we achieved a priority score for the problem area / proposed project. So those 5 aspects included how frequently the existing problem was observed. So if it's an area that there's flooding, how often does that happen? The impacts to property and public. So how many properties are flooded? How many folks are not able to use a roadway? If it's a roadway that's flooded, that's what that category means. The next one that's shown here is problem reduction. So that has more to do with the proposed solution. How much benefit do you get, or how much alleviation do you get from that solution? Resiliency is really representative of how sustainable the proposed solution is long term, and in terms of operation and maintenance and just maintaining that solution. And then finally, the obvious one is capital cost of the solution. So higher capital cost projects actually ranked slightly lower just because they're more difficult to implement. So at the end of the day, we got that single project priority score to use for comparison purposes, and that is on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being low, 10 being high. And for the purposes of our study and for the rest of this presentation, the threshold for a high priority project is a 7 or above. Okay, so we've gone through the study area, what we're trying to do, how we did our ranking. Now we're going to go through and discuss the findings and mitigation options. So this slide is really meant to be just a break slide. We did end up going out and doing site visits for all of the identified problem areas, and this is a selection of photos for some of those different problem areas. All right. How did we identify these problems? So as I mentioned, it's a very large study area, and the way that we decided to approach this was to ask those 18 municipalities to provide us feedback on what their perceived problem areas were within the watershed with flooding. Our goal was to try to get up to 3 problem areas identified per municipality. And we were very pleased we were able to receive feedback from all 18 municipalities within our study area. So from that effort, we ultimately heard back and got 75 problem areas or sites that were identified. And those 75 were narrowed to a total of 57 after just reconciling. There were some that were the same area but just called different things, that sort of thing. So at the end of the day, we ended up with a total of 57 problem areas that we evaluated further in the study. And the other takeaway from that exercise was that the flooding and wet weather issues really are watershed wide. Okay, so since we have such a large study area, we felt after getting that feedback that the best way to present our results, both in the report itself and also for the purposes of tonight's meeting, was to identify and further break down the watershed into 4 subwatersheds. So those are shown on this slide. The first being Upper Fishing Creek, shaded in green. The second being Middle Fishing Creek. The third is Little Fishing Creek. And then finally, the Hemlock Creek Lower Fishing Creek subwatershed. These boundaries were defined trying to generally keep drainage areas together, but we also tried to balance the number of municipalities per area. So we targeted 3 to 5 municipalities. They're roughly the same size, but we felt that this breakdown made sense for the purposes of discussing our results. So from here on out, I'm going to give you a brief summary of what we found in each sub-watershed, and also talk through some example problem areas and proposed mitigation areas for each of those sub-watersheds. So first up is Upper Fishing Creek. A quick explanation just of this graphic so that you can understand it. You'll see these dots that are labeled UFC dash a number, and those are shown in different colors. There is some methodology to that. First of all, the naming is simply UFC means Upper Fishing Creek. As we move forward more, you'll see that Middle Fishing Creek and the others have similar identification. And then the numbering is purely the problem area identification numbered sequentially to keep things straight as we're moving through our analysis. So you'll see on here UFCs 1 through 10, because there are 10 problem areas that were identified in Upper Fishing Creek. And the color coding is based on the type of issue that was noted. So this is the same throughout. I'm just going to use Upper Fishing Creek as an example. When you see problem areas that are coded in blue, that indicates a problem associated with water body flooding. If it's coded in green, which there don't happen to be in Upper Fishing Creek, that would delineate flooding because of lack of stormwater management facilities. The ones shown in red represent undersized or damaged infrastructure. And finally, those shown in orange are representative of erosion and sedimentation issues. Okay, so all of that aside, back to the Upper Fishing Creek summary. So as I mentioned, there were 10 problem areas identified within the Upper Fishing Creek subwatershed. Typical issues there include debris and log jams within the waterways, overbank flooding, and lots of properties along the channel and within the floodway. If all of the proposed mitigation measures for those 10 problem areas were to be implemented, we're talking $35 to $61 million. And if just the 3 high priority mitigation measures were to be implemented, we'd be talking a project cost of $24 to $44 million. I should also note here that the cost estimates and the proposed mitigation measures are certainly planning level at this point, and so we provide ranges for that reason. To move forward with any of these projects, more detailed design would have to be done and things would need to be refined. Our intent here with these cost estimates is to be on the conservative side for planning purposes to move forward with implementation. Okay. Another quick summary slide regarding Upper Fishing Creek. We did want to provide a graphic of problem area prioritization. So of the 10 problem areas identified, about 30% of them were categorized as high priority, another 30% as medium, and then the remaining 40 as low priority. As I stated before, we're going to go through one example problem area per sub-watershed, and chose to start with the most complex, so Benton area flooding, formerly known in our report as Upper Fishing Creek problem area number 8. So Benton Borough is located between 2 main channels, Fishing Creek and West Creek, and it's also relatively flat and lower than the top of Fishing Creek's bank. So there's lots of flooding areas within Benton due to constricted channel and just the confluence of those 2 water bodies. As far as proposed solutions for the Benton area, the graphic in the upper right-hand corner does show some of the conceptual solutions that were considered. We do have another slide coming up that's going to go through that briefly. There are also some photos of the existing conditions of the Benton Dam and then also West Creek taken from Waller Road. The proposed solutions that I'm going to discuss on the next slide are meant to reduce that local flooding, reduce stream velocities, try to alleviate impacts to the 200 plus properties that currently experience flooding within the borough, as well as the school districts, and upwards of 5,000 vehicles per day that are impacted when flooding occurs. So some of the proposed solutions, again, are the potential for levee and flood walls, removal of the dam, road reprofiling, and then some voluntary flood proofing. Estimated construction costs for those solutions range from 2 to 45 million, and our priority score associated with this problem area is a 7.2, so it's ranked as high as we're classifying it. All right, as I promised, Benton, because it's complicated, gets an extra slide for the example project. So I know this is very busy, but bear with me. It's a bit complicated. As I mentioned, first we're going to just briefly go through the color coding so that you understand what we're showing up here. What is shown in blue is what is currently designated as a high hazard area. And if it's still in blue with any of the concepts, that really just means that what we're proposing doesn't change the current flooding conditions. Yellow highlight represents a decrease in the area that is experiencing flooding. And then the purple or pink hatch that you're seeing represents an increase to the flood hazard level there. So briefly, the concepts that are shown here include concept 1, which is removal of Benton Dam and reprofiling of Fishing Creek to increase the capacity of that channel. That work is projected to potentially reduce the 100-year flood by a foot and therefore alleviate flooding for about 60 properties within the borough of Benton. Construction cost estimate for that project ranges from just over $700,000 to about $1.3 million. Other alternatives that we considered included 2 versions of flood wall and levee systems. So concept 2 would be reprofiling Waller Road and the addition of an approximate 1-mile levee along West Creek from Distillery Road to Waller Road. That levee or flood wall of itself would impact about 70 properties and cost somewhere between $12 to $22 million. Concept 3 is similar, but in that case, we would be adding approximately a mile of levee along Fishing Creek from Main Street to Waller Road. That portion would impact approximately 130 properties with a construction cost estimate of $11.5 to $21.5 million. And then the final on the bottom right-hand corner here, concepts 2 and 3 combined, would be to build those flood walls or levees on both sides, which just adding 2 and 3 together, those would impact about 200 properties, which is a little more than half of the borough, and cost somewhere between $23.5 to $43.5 million. So at this point, these are certainly meant to be conceptual solutions due to the scope of our study. We're looking at the whole watershed, so we couldn't do a detailed evaluation of Benton. This is our preliminary thoughts as to direction to take this, and we certainly think that it warrants further investigation, similar to what was done for the west end of Bloomsburg, to further define potential scopes and also really to investigate the benefit to cost ratio associated with implementation of any of these solutions. On to Middle Fishing Creek. So as we did before, this is the summary slide for Middle Fishing Creek. In Middle Fishing Creek, 21 problem areas were identified with typical issues including undersized bridges and culverts, overbank flooding, and then again, properties along the channel and within the floodway. If all mitigation measures associated with those problem areas were to be implemented, we'd be looking at a cost of $40 to $71 million. And of the problem areas, 8 of them were identified as higher priority mitigation measures. Implementing those measures would range between $3 to $5.6 million. This is a breakdown of the problem areas within Middle Fishing Creek. In this subwatershed, approximately little less than 40% were identified as high priority, little more than 40% were medium priority, and the remaining 20% were identified as low priority. The example project that we chose to talk through for Middle Fishing Creek is the Orangeville Mount Pleasant flooding. So this one is in Orange Township, and it is the flooding of Mount Pleasant Road, or SR 4034. So that was reported to us as a problem area due to constricted upstream channel and culvert. So the photo in the bottom left corner represents the existing condition there, and then the graphics to the right of this slide represent the proposed solution. So what we're proposing in this case is the replacement of that culvert to increase the capacity. Currently, it floods during a 25-year storm, and the proposed replacement would allow for a 100-year storm conveyance. We're also looking at the addition of a riparian buffer along the stream there, which would provide some stabilization of the banks, filter sedimentation. It would increase filtration and just in general lower the damage occurring when flooding does happen. That riparian buffer is about an acre. The estimated construction cost for this proposed solution is between $150,000 to $280,000, and it received a priority score based on our ranking of an 8. The benefits here is that it will reduce that roadway flooding that I mentioned. Based on PennDOT records, it's about 700 vehicles per day that travel this road and have problems when that flooding does occur. It would increase the capacity of the culvert, as I mentioned before. It will reduce erosion, and then there are direct property impacts for about 4 properties in this area. Moving on to Little Fishing Creek, this subwatershed had a total of 7 problem areas identified. Again, lots of undersized bridges and culverts. If we were to implement all of our proposed mitigation measures, it would be just under 6 to just over $10 million. And of those 7, 4 of the proposed mitigation measures were identified as high priority, ranging from $2.7 to $5.1 million to address those issues. Again, 60% of the problem areas in Little Fishing Creek were identified as high priority, and the remaining 40% were identified as medium priority. The example that we chose to go through for Little Fishing Creek is the Main Street Bridge in the borough of Millville. So due to an undersized bridge opening and associated constriction of the channel and floodway, it's been reported that there is flooding that occurs on Main Street, which is State Route 254 in the borough. The proposed solution here is to replace the bridge and do some floodplain reconnection. So floodplain reconnection really just means to regrade the floodplain to allow water to go where it wants to go. So if a stream bank is built up with fill within the floodway, you'd level that out, get rid of some of that vegetation, and allow that water to flow the way it had originally intended to do. Construction costs associated with this mitigation measure is $2.4 to $4.5 million, and it received a priority ranking of 8.2. The benefits are reduced flooding, as I mentioned before. Currently, the bridge is able to convey a 2-year storm, and the replacement, as we've modeled it, could convey a 25-year storm. It'll also reduce that stream velocity with the floodplain reconnection, and reduce traffic impacts to approximately 2,900 vehicles per day. There are also approximately 10 properties that are directly impacted by this flooding currently that would be mitigated. Finally, our last sub area is Hemlock Creek, Lower Fishing Creek. This is also the area that the West End study covered, but we do not really include that in our analysis. I just needed to note that this is the area where that overlap occurred. There were a total of 19 problem areas identified within this subwatershed. Typical issues included undersized bridges and culverts, constricted channels, and floodplains. If all mitigation measures were to be implemented, it'd be a range of $31 to $57 million, and the two high priority mitigation measures would cost between $1.4 to $2.5 million to implement. Again, those costs do not include what Borton Lawson was proposing as part of their work in the West End. So of the 19 problem areas, about 10% were determined to be high priority, about 60% medium priority, and the remaining 30 were identified as low priority. Our example project for Hemlock Creek, Lower Fishing Creek is the Perry Avenue Bridge. Flooding along Perry Avenue and associated backwater conditions were reported due to an undersized bridge opening and constricted channel slash floodway. So this is the last bridge on Hemlock Creek before it discharges to Fishing Creek. And interesting fact, the upstream bridge, which is Route 42 over Fishing Creek, has 10 times the conveyance capacity of this bridge. So the proposed solution here is bridge replacement, and again, that floodplain reconnection that we talked about before. Estimated construction cost is $1.3 to $2.5 million. And also should be noted that this bridge has been identified for potential replacement by PennDOT. There's been discussions over the last 10 years or so about replacement of this bridge, so we feel that there is good opportunity to potentially partner and make this a multi-purpose project because the condition of the bridge itself is not great. This project received a priority score of 7 for us. So the benefits here, again, are to reduce that roadway flooding, increase the capacity of the bridge. We're going to take it from ability to carry a 10-year storm to a 25-year storm, reducing that stream velocity, and reducing that impact to the projected 450 vehicles per day. This one also has a direct impact to about 4 properties adjacent to it. All right, so I went through those examples pretty quickly. Just want to wrap up the presentation with some discussion regarding next steps, because this is something that's been very important to the commissioners. They wanted this study to be done to give them tools to truly go out and implement and try to address some of these flooding areas. So in our minds, the next steps are county and municipal partnering to make these projects come to fruition, as well as obviously identifying funding sources to get these projects done. If all of our mitigation measures were to be implemented, we'd be looking at over 1,000 properties being directly impacted in a positive way. There's about 2,000 right now in the watershed that are classified as high hazard, so we'd be impacting a little over half of them, and also helping out more than 10,000 trips per day that are impacted with these localized flooding that's seen in a lot of these problem areas throughout the watershed. So how do we do that? We target what we feel are the low-hanging projects and prioritize mitigation measures to scope projects and actually get some of this construction done. So in our minds, that is some of the utility type replacements, those culvert replacements. They're relatively low cost and pretty high benefit, and probably the easiest to implement. And we have provided a list of what we feel are the most readily implementable proposed mitigation projects to the county and to some of the legislative folks who've been working with us on this project. Also, active implementation would provide active flood protection and prevention at those problem area sites. So a lot of this is localized solutions. to address those areas that are seen specifically on the problem area sites. But we did also want to highlight that implementation of these measures does have some level of long-term watershed scale impacts when they're implemented. So depending on where you look in the watershed, we're projecting somewhere between a 1 and a 10% peak flow reduction for a 2-year storm, and somewhere between 0 and 5% for a 100-year storm. Those on the lower end of that range are generally the boroughs and the Bloomsburg area. And then the ones that you see the higher scale percentage reductions are really within the Hemlock Creek watershed, just because of the way that's laid out there. Finally, we focused a lot on the specific problem area and mitigation measures that we've identified, but it also is important to remember that recommendation and implementation of preventative mitigation strategies is important. This is discussed at length in our report, but we wanted to mention it here this evening. We really think that it's important to have responsible land planning and floodplain management. That would include implementation of the countywide action plan that's been developed by the county, putting in place flood control and floodplain requirements to prevent new risks, making sure that there's flood warning systems in place to prepare residents if flooding is projected to occur, revisions to timbering and E&S controls regulations to try to prevent some of that debris buildup that happens, adding some buffer requirements for creek corridors to allow natural functions of the streams, and just all of these things put together provide cumulative benefits in flood protection over time. So that was a lot that I just went through to try to boil down this study into 20-25 minutes. We're going to break now to the open house style during the live version and allow folks to ask questions specific to their geography. I also will note that our final report will be made available through the study website, and the link to that website is there. Please feel free to reach out to either Matt Vanaski or myself if you have any specific questions on what you've heard during this presentation. Thank you.